Good morning and welcome everybody. I'm Alejandro Werner. I'm the director of Georgetown Americas Institute, and I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today, Juan Gonzalez, who's going to speak about the Summit of the Americas beyond the headline. In early June 2022, leaders from 23 countries across the Americas convened in LA to participate in the 9th Summit of the Americas and discuss regional challenges, priorities, and opportunities. Several new initiatives were announced at this year's summit, including the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, and the Biden administration's announcement of a capitalization of the Inter-American Development Bank private investment arm. In a conversation with Georgetown professor Diana Kapiszewski, Special Assistant to President Joe Biden and National Security Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez, will explore these new initiatives and more. Very briefly, all of you know Juan Gonzalez very well. He serves as Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere at the U.S. National Security Council. Most recently, he was Senior Fellow at the Penn Biden Center for Global Diplomacy and Global Engagement. He had several positions in the administration, in several administrations. And before that, he was an Associate Vice President at the Cohen Group. He was also appointed by Senator Chuck Schumer to serve as the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission. He's also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a board member of the Washington Office on Latin America, and member of the Advisory Board of Foreign Policy for America. And he's also a graduate from Georgetown, from the Masters in Latin American Studies, and he has a BS from SUNY at Buffalo. He's a native of Cartagena, Colombia. Joining him in this conversation is Professor Diana Kapiszewski. She's an associate professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. Her current work examines judicial politics and the uses of law in Latin America. Her first book, High Courts and Economic Governance in Argentina and Brazil, which received the APSA Law and Courts Section C Herman Preacher Award, explores High Court elected branch interactions over economic policy in Argentina and Brazil in the post-transition period. She will be leading our Center for Latin American Studies after her sabbatical, and she will be starting in the summer of 2023. So with that, I will turn it over to Diana. And again, I want to thank Juan for joining us again for these discussions and updates on U.S. policies and diplomacy with Latin America. Diana, the screen is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alejandro. And again, Juan, welcome to Georgetown, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. I'll start off with a few questions about the Summit of the Americas, and then ask some broader questions about U.S. engagement with the region and politics in the Americas. First, though, we'd like to ask a few questions about the summit. So as we know, the summit addressed a range of concerns from economic recovery to climate change to health to migration and beyond. Would it be possible for you to sort of summarize for us what you see as the main takeaways or perhaps as the main accomplishments of the summit over that week?
Thank you, Diana, and congratulations, and thank you, Alejandro, for having me, and greetings to the broader Georgetown University community. If I were to just summarize the summit, I would say that notwithstanding what was a lot of coverage and reporting on participation, when the cameras were off and the leaders sat around the table and talked about these issues, they focused on some of the core challenges facing the Americas, from lack of competitiveness to issues of food insecurity, the ongoing impact of the pandemic, and the need to ensure that our democracies are delivering in terms of providing greater equity and social benefit to populations that well before the pandemic had been protesting for greater freedoms and for change. And in those conversations, I'll say specifically, what I found most interesting from just a personal perspective was the final leaders retreat. And a leaders retreat is when you have the presidents around a table eating lunch, and they each bring one person. So you don't have these large rooms, you don't have large cameras in there, and they actually have an opportunity to talk more freely. The president in that setting put aside all the briefing materials that we gave to him and talked about the how Russia's invasion of Ukraine was something that the world needed to care about, and that it was something that meant a lot about just kind of the first military incursion in Europe, I think since World War II, the impact it was having on inflation, on food security prices, and the need for us to have an open and candid debate about what is the international community really we should be standing for, and how we should debate some of these sorts of issues. And it was a fascinating discussion because the leaders found, I think, a lot of common ground on the need to work together to address the impacts of the invasion, the need to push for peace, the need for diplomacy to really be supreme in any sort of interactions between states, and the responsibilities that not just the countries of the region, but the United States had to continue to engage in a dialogue about how we could work together. And all of that really, I think, dovetailed to a lot of the agenda topics that were discussed and agreed to it at the summit. But I'll say the final thing is, and this is actually from President Boric, who made a very clear point toward the end. He said, look, the success at the summit is, we can slap our, kind of pat ourselves on the back all we want for having a successful summit, but we'll be measured by what we can do on June 11th and after. And that's really been a lot of the focus since we came back from Los Angeles.
And that leads directly into the next question that I was going to ask you, which is, what do you think will be actually the likely concrete practical outcomes of the summit? The initiatives that Alejandro mentioned sound wonderful, but what will implementation look like, and how successful will it be in your view?
Sure. So the first is, I would say that in the run up to the summit, in the year and a half that the president has been in office, if we've taken an inventory, and you see that there's been a very active pace of personal engagement, calls, engagements, and we announced this morning that the president of Mexico would be coming up here on July 12th. We also have plans to have the president of Argentina, and already, I think, publicly said that the president of Ecuador would also be invited to Washington. The president's going to travel to Canada in the coming months as well. And that doesn't even include what has been very active engagement led by the vice president on the Caribbean to establish a series of working groups on everything from food security to energy security to modernizing how the international financial institutions respond to challenges in small island states that are considered high income and therefore don't have access to a lot of the tools that other countries do. Those are going on and will continue to take place between now and I think the next milestone for us is going to be the OAS General Assembly in early October in Lima, Peru, where we're going to look to advance a lot of the commitments at the summit, maybe even have meetings on the side, and then I think into the spring. Now, what I'll say is that the LA Declaration on Migration, which is arguably what got the most press, it took the migration conversation from one of the U.S.-Mexico border to one of the need for us to look at this issue comprehensively from countries that are origin, transit, and destination, not just in terms of migration policy, but and enforcement, but rather asylum, refugee protections, providing, helping provide countries with the economic tools to, be able to absorb some of these populations. These are conversations that are already ongoing as the historic migration crisis that we're seeing is not slowing down. We saw the tragic news of migrants that were being smuggled, that, we're 450 now, that is the death toll that we have counted, is something that we need to not just go after the smugglers, but also create conditions for these protections to exist, not just in the United States and Mexico, but throughout the region. I would say that the focus right now, and then I want to talk about the Americas Partnership, the focus right now is we put a lot of commitments forward on food security, on health, on supporting countries with a climate, or I'm sorry, a concessional finance facility for those countries that are doing the right thing on migration. We're looking for right now to deploy those funds and start executing right away to show that we're taking concrete steps immediately after the summit. On the Americas Partnership, which is I think in my view, something that is going to really shape and inform our economic engagement during the remainder of the Biden administration can be summarized as us building on and filling the gaps of free trade agreements. And what we are doing is, which is no small task, is sitting down with the U.S. Trade Representative, with the Department of Treasury, with Department of State, to really start preparing for engagements at the OAS General Assembly to figure out what is going to be our timeline for actually executing on this. What are the outcomes that as governments we really want to aim toward on everything from digital trade to decarbonization to to something that is generally referred to as renewing the social contract, but being pre-distributional policies on how we actually can help the countries of the region address some of the economic challenges that they face. I think the most challenging of these is going to be probably the conversations at the Inter-American Development Bank, because we're not just looking to expand private capital lending, which is something that was low comparative to other regions during the pandemic, but also looking at how multilateral development banks change the way they do their work, from a focus that is primarily on poverty reduction and infrastructure to actually finding a way to emphasize the D in the bank by delivering greater global public goods on everything from climate change to equity, the adoption of technology. These sorts of things are ones that are going to require conversations with the board members about what we want these banks to actually do to be able to help America, the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean come back from the pandemic, but also be competitive in the century.
Great. So that is really helpful to understand all of that. There was an emphasis, an understandable emphasis, since you work for the U.S. government, in what you just said about what the U.S. will do. But sort of regional initiatives, cooperation, collaboration, integration has traditionally been a struggle for Latin America. And so all of those initiatives will require the entire region working together to carry those things forward. So how, and I heard you say the OAS General Assembly in October will have additional conversations. But what are some of the other mechanisms on which you will draw or which you will create to bring the countries together to actually coordinate to move those initiatives forward?
Yeah, excellent question. And since we have the chair of the Summit Implementation Review Group, the coming out of the summit, rather than having one declaration that, if you look at the history of the summit, less of those have been signed than actually been signed, we decided with the other national summit coordinators to work on a series of 5 political commitments. And those they range everything from climate to health and health security to digital adoption. And I'll give 2 specific examples in areas where under the leadership of the State Department, we're going to be working with regional governments to implement. One is on digital connectivity and to ensuring that we're working as a region to expand access to technology and to the internet, frankly, because as we've all seen during the pandemic, the socioeconomic impact of on those who did not have access to a computer were people that for over a year were not able to go to school. So expanding access to technology and to the internet is something that actually have a broad socioeconomic impact. The other is the America's Health Dialogue, where we are looking to, with the region, not just taking the conversation that from our sharing of vaccines during the pandemic, which we shared over 70 million vaccines with the region, to really starting to talk about how we can actually expand manufacturing and production capability to prepare for the future pandemics. And that's something that we're going to, with the countries of the region, it requires conversations not just with health ministers, but with finance ministers, with private sector stakeholders. And that's something that out of the summit process, we need to work on together. It seems like a lot of meetings as the end goals, but the reality is that when you're talking about regulatory coordination, trying to establish the conditions for the private sector to set up shop and to be able to, establish production capability in places that have the resources, Brazil, for example, it requires us to find alignment between government, the private sector, and other stakeholders. And we're setting out a roadmap to be able to move as quickly as possible to execute on that. We'll be announcing this summer the date for the America's Health Ministerial to bring all these ministers together and advance that discussion. And those are just 2 examples of some of the initiatives, but there are others on governance to make sure that, and this is not, all countries did not sign on to this, but an initiative to strengthen and support transparent journalism in the Americas as a way to really kind of bolster the backbone of our democratic institutions. So those are just a couple examples of initiatives that we'll be pushing across, not just the US government, but in a coordinated fashion with the countries of the region.
Great, thank you. Just one more question about the summit and going back to the U.S. perspective a little bit, and then we'll move a little bit towards thinking about the Americas and the world. But back to the summit, I think a lot of people were hoping to get an idea, a clear vision of U.S. policy in the hemisphere from the summit, even though that it's not an only a place for the U.S. to have a platform. Obviously, it is a place where the U.S. has a platform. So would you say that was achieved in your view, that coming out of that, the U.S. had clearly articulated their vision for the region, and if you could say what you think that is?
Sure. So I think the president's speech on the inauguration night of the ceremony was, in my view, not just because I helped contributed to it, probably one of the best speeches since the Cold War on Latin America and the Caribbean. Why is that? Because to those of us that follow Latin America and the Caribbean, you see that there have been times throughout U.S. history, generally during times of conflict in Central Europe, that has led the United States to realign on policy toward the Americas, whether it's good neighbor policy or during the Cold War, the Alliance for Progress. It has led to, in many ways, a renewed focus on the region, in an outline, in some cases, of a doctrine or a specific policy that would inform U.S. engagement. Now, if you look at that speech, the first, I think, element of that that maybe was implicit was that I think a recognition that the ability of the United States to be a superpower, quote unquote, to play a key role not just in the pushback on Russia's kind of unjustified military invasion of Ukraine, but the response to the pandemic, responses to non-proliferation, every issue where the United States has played an important role on the global stage requires a stable, a secure and prosperous Latin America and the Caribbean. Throughout our history, the United States has taken different approaches to promote that history. You could, cite the Dulles brothers and their approach in places like Guatemala as a way to ensure stability. But the president's perspective as a statement of national security policy has made very clear that a region that is secure, middle class, and democratic is fundamentally in the national security interest of the United States, as something that allows us to prosper as a nation, to be secure as a nation, and to be able to play a leadership role internationally. The other is that the region's democratic self-determination is also something that is in our national security interest, meaning that it doesn't matter if a leader is of the left or of the right, where they are on the political spectrum, as long as they are elected and governed democratically, we will seek to engage with them. And you've seen that with how quickly the president called the president of Colombia. We need to find ways to advance those sorts of interests. And then the last is that, a lot of the initiatives that we rolled out, have very specific focus areas, but at their center, they're trying to respond to some of the core challenges that Latin America and the Caribbean is facing, not from a paternalistic perspective, but one where we are working with the regions as partners to address what we see as issues that are undermining the viability of democracy in a region where, there are more democracies in the Western Hemisphere than anywhere else in the world. And it's an area where even with countries that disagree with us, these democratic norms, these efforts toward integration are ones that frankly are aligned with US values and interests. And so that in itself are a core set of statements of US policy that are, I think, fundamental and perhaps one of the strongest, I think, articulations of US policy toward the Americas since Bill Clinton launched the summit process in 1994 and launched 28 years of a free trade focused agenda, a kind of counter-narcotics focused agenda that at the time made sense, but today we realize we need to address some of these underlying challenges that Latin America and the Caribbean are facing.
Great. So what you laid out was sort of a series of desiderata or challenges that the region is that we would like to see in the region, or that the region is facing. So to derive US policy from that would be, we will work with regional partners in order to make the region prosperous, make the region secure, and advance democracy in the region.
That's correct. And it's also because the danger is as well that if you look at the demographic trends in Latin America and the Caribbean, the region's lack of competitiveness, if we don't do something, it will be something that will not just lead to greater instability in Latin America and the Caribbean, but it will undermine, I think, the national security of the United States, our leadership abroad. And so it's fundamentally in our interest to ensure that Latin America prospers and succeeds for our own sake.
Great. Okay. I have another few questions that are about the Americas in the world, but they harken back a little bit to something that you already mentioned. So the first question actually has to do with Russia's war on Ukraine. And that war sort of ironically has presented both opportunities and challenges for the Americas, right? So it has set the Americas up to potentially benefit from another commodities boom. And yet we see inflation, double digits in many countries of the region. So on balance, so two questions. One, on balance, what effect do you anticipate the war will have on the region? And then simultaneously, and you spoke to this previously, what effect do you think it will have on US policy in the region? Do you anticipate a realignment, as you called it before, and a renewed emphasis on the region in the shadow of that conflict?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, because it gets to some of these, I think, enduring values that characterize the Americas. One is the belief in non-intervention, and the resounding rejection by the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean at the UN General Assembly following Russia's invasion was a reflection not of their alignment with the US or their alignment with Europe, but the strongly held beliefs that nations don't invade other nations. And I think that's important, because at the same time, we're having complicated conversations now, because, as you mentioned, the impact of inflation are ones where the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean are asking, okay, how long is this going to go for, and how is this going to impact me at a time when the inflation has erased any sort of benefit I could have derived from the commodities boom? The other is, what is the future of the G20? If in such a short order we have basically rolled back decades to integrate Russia into the international economy, what are going to be these tools of international kind of or global architecture where Latin America and the Caribbean can play a role and shape some of these conversations? What does this mean for these institutions that we developed? And I think these are important conversations for us to have. Now, in terms of how the US responds to this, number one is we have to address the kind of the immediate issues, help Latin America and the Caribbean address these issues, the issues of inflation. So in the summit, the president spoke with with Canada, with Mexico, with Argentina, and even with Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana about doing everything we could to make sure that we were working together to address issues of food insecurity. But then the others are, obviously trying to resolve the situation in Europe, but trying to make sure that we're developing these mechanisms that respond to the region's immediate needs. That's I think on the immediate kind of economic side. But on the other is engaging with Latin America and the Caribbean, as the president did at the leaders retreat, on where things are headed, or where they see things headed as in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Having these conversations with Brazil and Argentina as members of the G20, and taking their views in account, and engaging Latin America and the Caribbean not as members that you are, kind of trying to drive votes at the UN General Assembly, but rather integrating them into the conversation, because their views and their equities in terms of how the international world order kind of comes out on the other side of this is going to be incredibly important and relevant to us, and we have to be there to listen. And on that, just to not to extend myself, but the other thing that I found remarkable was at the leaders retreat, but also in the meeting that the president had with Caribbean leaders, was that the president kind of gave his perspective, but mostly he said that he wanted to listen. And he wanted to get the perspectives of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And on more than one occasion, leaders, either in the press or remarked to us, they said that they've never had an experience where a president of the United States was actually listening, taking notes, and wanting to follow up on, treating the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean as the president sees them, which is fundamentally as key partners that we need to be engaging with constructively.
So to try to summarize what that realignment or that increased engagement might look like, is it, well, I'll try to summarize and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's sort of partnering with Latin America to, as the world evolves, as the international system evolves, partnering with the countries of Latin America to try to jointly identify what the place of the Western Hemisphere is in an increasingly complicated global landscape. Is it something like that?
That's exactly right. And the only thing I would add is, if you look back at the good neighbor policies, Cordell Hull flew down to Argentina and, had to meet them where they are to try to ensure that they stayed in the good neighbor policy as they were trying to figure out which way to go. For Latin America and the Caribbean, is you just need to be present, I think, is an important, element of this, and that U.S. diplomacy has to be competitive, because it's not enough, I think, to wag our finger at Latin America and the Caribbean on China to expect that they're going to align with us. I think the danger to that approach is that you'll see a rising non-aligned movement around the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, because as you mentioned, with these constraints, countries are going to have to be pragmatic. And the question is, who comes forward with an affirmative agenda? So we do have to be diplomatic and present diplomatically, just as we are having this conversation about the place of Latin America and the Caribbean in the world.
Great. And you keep anticipating my next questions, which makes my job very easy. So my next question was actually about China. China obviously has emerged as a core trade partner for major countries in the hemisphere, excepting Mexico and Colombia. It's engaging heavily in infrastructure. So what does the U.S. see as the long-term ramifications of China's involvement in the hemisphere? And do we anticipate or have an expectation or have a fear that ultimately China will pull the region away from the West?
That's a great question. And what I'll say is that, in the conversations we've had with countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, I traveled when National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan traveled to the region for the first time in May of last year. We went to Brazil and Argentina. And his message is the same as the president has delivered to others, is that we're not asking other countries to choose between us and China. Certainly, we trade with China and we alternate between competition, confrontation, and collaboration. But there are very clear distinctions in terms of the nature of that engagement. Their efforts at military expansion in other parts of the world, the lack of transparency that characterizes a lot of their investments, the political pressure that comes with the sharing of vaccines that are sold, not given away like we did, and just their view that democratic norms are really not important, or really are not really kind of values that must be respected and upholded. For us, again, it's the question of democratic self-determination, as countries being able to choose which route they're going to take, the allies, the interests that they're going to advance within a democratic space where democratic development is really the blueprint that all of us are following. But again, we can't wag our finger to say, well, you can't go with Huawei, even though there are no other competitors that are offering to build your 5G infrastructure. We have to put forward an affirmative agenda that responds to the region needs. And I say that because the word China, I think, at least in the meetings I was with, never came up. Why? Because I think, at least from our side, what we're talking about is, what is the United States putting on the table? And what we're putting on the table is something that China and Russia cannot offer, which is to be able to galvanize hemispheric action on core challenges like climate change, like the pandemic and other issues that are facing all of us, changing the institution of multilateral development banks so they are responding to the needs of middle and high income countries. Finding ways to make sure that we are using our economic relationships to improve the lives of the people of Latin America and the Caribbean. That's very different from importing protein and fuel from Latin America and the Caribbean, which is what characterizes Chinese trade.
Okay, great. Thank you. that let me then switch a little bit to refocus on the U.S. in the hemisphere. Over the years, the war on drugs in the hemisphere has become more complicated by the greater involvement of organized crime. So cocaine is a global business at this point in time. Coca output continues to rise in some countries. But what we simultaneously, and I think we saw this in the Colombian presidential election, there's something of an exhaustion in the hemisphere with the war on drugs on two very different ends of the political spectrum there. So what does the U.S. see as the way forward on the drug issue?
Yes, and so Alejandro mentioned this. I was fortunate to serve as a commissioner on the bipartisan Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission. We issued a report in November of 2020, making recommendations on counter-narcotics policy. We have, maybe quietly or not as publicly as some would like, is starting to actually implement on some of this. What does that start with? It starts with, for us, focusing on the issue of demand reduction at home, treating drug addiction as a public health challenge. And this administration has put billions of dollars toward that goal just in the first year of the administration alone. It's something that really is the most important thing the United States can do to address the issue of drug addiction, but also drug trafficking, is to reduce demand. The other is, with the Mexico bicentennial framework, and then just with the bicentennial partnership with Colombia, we put forward, I think, a much more comprehensive vision on these issues that, in the case of Colombia, was intended to respond to some of the frustration among the Colombian public. For example, with a coca eradication metric that defined a lot of our approach to the drug trade and to coca specifically, that looks at issues of rule of law and judicial institutions, issues of environmental protection, issues of economic opportunity, at the same time that we are making sure that you do need to arrest bad people. You do need to, I think, in a way that is effective, eradicate the production of drugs. But that shouldn't be the measure of success, the amount of coca that you eradicate, but rather how you actually can create the alternatives, how you can actually create judicial institutions that respond to anybody, regardless of where they are, and then effectively finding ways to reduce the demand in the United States as the key step. But at the, Joaquin Villalobos, who's from El Salvador, a very respected academic, wrote an op-ed a very long time ago that I actually keep and reread, that the question of the drug trade in Latin America and the Caribbean is as much a question about the presence of the state as it is about the demand for drugs in the US. So you get rid of drugs and there are no more drugs anywhere to be trafficked, you will still have illegal mining. You will still have criminal organizations that can operate because there's an open space for corruption to flourish in certain areas, the lack of access to education. And so these are, I think, the broader questions of our initiatives at the summit, whether it's on economics, whether it's on health security. All of these are ones that are intended to address some of the challenges of populations that in some countries seem to have been forgotten by kind of the development that has touched the urban areas of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear you take that broader view on this issue, because without the institutional infrastructure set up, there will continue to be impunity. And without economic opportunity, people will continue to choose to engage in these activities because they're lucrative. So to have you sort of taking that holistic view on this and looking at it from all sides is really, as a political scientist, is really wonderful to hear. The other question I had about the U.S. and the hemisphere has to do with the question of ambassadors to the region. So I think there are, the U.S. has not appointed yet ambassadors to 10 countries in the Americas. And this obviously belies how important the region is to the president and to the United States. So what do you see as the way through the ambassadorial impasse at which we are in certain countries right now?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a challenge all over the world. First of all, whether it's those who have been appointed but have not had a hearing, those who've had a hearing but have not made it out of committee or been voted. There's a very large number of those, and we are actually in a position where we're about to start announcing another kind of cohort of ambassadors to some of the posts that haven't been nominated. Look, what I'll say is the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate in particular has a role of advice and consent, and it is a role that they will play, and they will raise concerns that we will try to work through. But it is of utmost priority to try to get our ambassadors in country as quickly as possible. But it is something that is impacting us, I think, throughout the world. I would be, particularly in places like Colombia, we've yet to announce an ambassador. I know the process is ongoing, and it can take some time, but it is fundamentally in our interest to have an ambassador down there. At the same time, we have Frank Mora, who's been, was nominated a long time ago to be ambassador to the Organization of American States. He's now on the floor. We are at a disadvantage in following through on the summit without Frank there, because until we have an ambassador that is as respected and as experienced as him, we're at a disadvantage. Same thing in a number of other posts where we have excellent foreign service officers, but it's not the same as having a Senate confirmed U.S. ambassador.
So that, I think we're in agreement that it's definitely a challenge. So how do you see what's the path forward in terms of getting ambassadors, as you say, not only in Latin America, but in other countries in the world as well?
Sure. So, I think before the Senate goes on recess, we hope to have as many of those ambassadors confirmed and down at post as possible. And there's a significant number of them. They're from Chile to the OAS to others. And then also before I think before the end of the Congress, at the end of the calendar year, try to make sure that we're announcing and confirming as many of those as possible. Now, we're in an election year, certainly, but there are also a lot of career ambassadors that I think have served under Republican and Democratic administrations, and in an ideal world should have no problem getting confirmed. But I think it is, at least this summer, trying to get as many through, and then before the end of the year, as many down at post as we can, as humanly possible.
Okay, let me ask one or possibly two more substantive questions, and then we will open it up to Q&A if the audience would like to put some questions in the Q&A box. And this next question of mine is more sort of about politics in the Americas, so domestic politics, but issues that are very important to the United States, as you said, one of them being democracy. So as Levitsky and Ziblatt have now famously noted, in contemporary Latin America, democracies just don't die at the barrel of a gun. They die in a slow slide towards autocracy. Not just Latin America, but certainly that would be the dynamic in Latin America. So do you fear this is the direction in which the hemisphere is going? We have certain examples, Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and we certainly have counterexamples. So what do you see as the future of the region with regard to democracy or strengthening democracy?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, Diana, because it's hard to predict that, because I think that a lot of us maybe thought that U.S. democratic institutions were stronger than they actually are, right? It has been, I think, as an American, concerning that something that is a naturalized American, something that we kind of grew to trust and knew would never change. Democracies are, they're yours, but you got to work to keep them, I think I'm paraphrasing horribly somebody. I think when I look at Latin America and the Caribbean and the issue of democracy, I have to think about it from the context of U.S. policy, because the United States in its policy can help or hurt democracy. And it can do so if we take an approach that we have in the past, and particularly during the Cold War, where we will align with somebody that is aligned with our short-term national security interests, and will overlook their kind of democratic, respect for democratic norms to advance a short-term interest. The approach that we have taken is that we have recognized that we're going to need to accept some short-term challenges and instability in the name of a broader principle, where if we actually are standing for democracy, regardless of whether or not we agree with somebody, that it is actually something that can bolster and help the democratic process, not just how people are elected, but how they govern. In doing so, we're also in many ways aligning ourselves with the people of Latin America and the Caribbean that are not voting more leaders of the left. What they're doing is they are just broadly dissatisfied with the traditional political order and are voting out incumbents. They believe that governments, if you look at the polls, will tell you that they feel like governments aren't working for them, but rather for those that are the political and economic elite in the country. That, you know, in places like Colombia, where I was born, that you have people that graduate from the country's best universities and with degrees in law and medicine, only to be driving cabs because there aren't opportunities for everybody. These are questions of democracy fundamentally. And I think for the United States, as is the instinct often is, well, that leader may have been elected democratically, but we don't like them, so we can't accept their credibility. I think at a time when we are going through, I think, these turns of the crank on democracy that led to, in Chile, from the alternation of power from left and right, in places like Colombia, for the first time to elect a leader of the left, whereas in the past, you would have military juntas interrupt that kind of pendulum progression. The US has to stand by the principles that here in the United States we hold so dear, and recognize that in the medium to long term, it will be something that will advance our interests, and frankly, be something that at a time when countries are feeling, going back to the China issue, are feeling buyer's remorse with some of the characteristics of Chinese engagement. It is these democratic norms and values that, you know, a lot of people have fought and died for, that will at the end of the day lead to a conversation about what should other countries, you know, kind of values and norms they should uphold when they come to invest or engage in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think those questions are perhaps abstract and academic for a lot, but for those of us that have been following this region for this long, they're fundamental to, I think, the region's development.
Absolutely. And to hear you sort of think, base US policies on those broader principles and those longer term views, perhaps with our perspective renewed, given the institutional churn in the United States, is really both reassuring. It's really reassuring to hear. So thank you.
With that, I'm sorry, can I
sorry,
just
circle back?
please.
Sorry
to keep, and you know, sometimes you'll have these conversations in policy settings, and some folks will say, well, that's not our policy around the world. In places like the Middle East, we don't believe, we don't recognize Hamas, even though they were democratically elected. And I'm quick to point out the significant differences with Latin America and the Caribbean, because again, these are all revolutionary governments by definition. We all, we're former colonies that have fought against kind of colonial rule. Number two, we have all, most of us have experimented with autocratic and revolutionary governments and have reaffirmed democracy as the development track that we are on. And it is something that I think the democracy ingredient in the Western Hemisphere is, I think, something that is unique, but it's also fundamental to our national security interests in a way that maybe it isn't in other parts of the world. So I think the contrast is there, but I think it's for a reason.
Great, thank you very much. With that, I will open it up to a little bit broader Q&A for our last 15 minutes and give the first question to Alejandro.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks, Juan, again. And I really enjoy the way you describe your engagement with Latin America and the strong focus on strengthening together the democratic environment. And sometimes when we criticize a little bit what we are seeing today, we forget that maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the region was plagued with military governments. On the economic front, we were plagued with the hyperinflations, debt crisis, etc. And for the most part, with all its problems, I mean, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty, etc. But mostly in large economies, a democratic region. And on the economic side, a lot of stability that has been ingrained in the system. And in this part, I would like to ask you a little bit, how did the politicians and the business side of the Summit of the Americas eventually met to talk about nearshoring, energy transition, etc., and how can we work with the private sector to make that happen faster and to make this integration that you talked about a reality, let's say, in the next 10 years, 5 years?
Thank you, Alejandro. And I think just this is an area where I think Georgetown and is kind of the intellectual reservoir that you all have in this area is key. In the run-up to the summit, we talked to the private sector and the organizers of the CEO forum, much like we do for a lot of other engagements, like the upcoming visit of the Mexican president. And we'll say to them, I'll be very candid. We'll say, look, we don't understand nearly as much about supply chains as you all do. We do understand that this is an enormous task, and that ultimately what we need to do is create the conditions for the private sector to want to, nearshore, friendshore, whatever you want to call it. So we'll say to them, can you help us prioritize? Help us figure out what needs to go first. What are the most important issues that need to be addressed right now, and what are the challenges that you think that the government needs to start working toward? Issues of, I mentioned regulatory coordination and cohesion are incredibly mundane and boring, but also so important for the private sector to have the necessary incentives. But the other is also just, as we're looking at, I think these, because a lot of times when you're talking to even Fortune 100 and 500 companies will have strategic outlooks, but they're looking to make plan just like anybody else for their shareholders. I think that's where you have academics and other actors come in, because when you're talking about this basic question of, are the multilateral development banks rising to the challenge at hand? Do we have the right frameworks in place? Do we have the right tools in place? These are questions that I know a lot of professors and researchers at Georgetown have probably spent their lifetime working on. Some have been former central bankers and finance ministers that have had to deal with these issues, and some have worked at the multilaterals and can actually create a body of work and research that can inform a lot of this process. So I think these sorts of conversations and forums are really important, particularly the Americas Partnership, as we are, we have the framework, we have an understanding of where we want to get to with countries that we've started to talk to. We've established for ourselves a timeline for this plan of 6 months to a year, and are working to identify very clear, ambitious, but achievable goals. One of the key elements that we want to integrate into this is active stakeholder consultation, not just in terms of particular specific commercial issues, but what are some things that policymakers can do, whether it's on the executive side or whether it's even getting Congress to get engaged, to make sure that we're establishing the tools necessary. Again, I go back to this, and Alejandro, I'm careful to not try to speak intelligently to this, given your background and expertise. But I also think that like Latin America and the Caribbean, if you look at it, the rest of the world is not competitive in today's world. It's not competitive because it continues to depend on commodities. Human capital is well below, I think, some of its peers, these are fundamental issues that if Latin America does not address, and if we don't find a way to lower the political cost of governments taking decisions to try to address some of these things, then there's very little the US government can do on its own, or the private sector can do on its own, if you don't actually create the conditions for governments to start investing in addressing the transition to the energies of the future, and actually starting investing in education, reducing levels of informality, et cetera. Those are things that I think that there's a sense of urgency to all of them.
Thanks.
Great. So I'm looking at the Q&A and trying to gather together some questions. One interesting question has to do with what may be coming in the future in Latin American countries with regard to protest. So we obviously saw a wave of protests in 2019 throughout many countries, or the late 2010s and into 2019 in many countries. That was a little bit tamped down then by the pandemic, but we might expect to see that continue with rising prices and with inflation. So and that's obviously a delicate balance, right? That's freedom of expression versus security. So is that something on which the US government works with Latin American countries or consults with Latin American countries, or is that purely a domestic issue?
Well, I mean, certainly, I think post-pandemic, we're going to see definitely more protests. Not just that, but the increases in interest rates in the United States, a potential slowdown in the US economy is going to impact Latin America, just as the pandemic impacted Latin America more than any other part of the world. And certainly there's concern given the a highly indebted nature right now of a lot of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. I think the question is, I would look to what's going on right now in Ecuador as a good kind of perhaps harbinger of what may come, or characteristics of what a lot of leaders are going to be dealing with. On the one hand, you have CONAIE, an indigenous organization that is feeling the impact of inflation and is demanding things from the state. It's requiring the Lasso government to think about what it can afford and what it can realistically do. With commodity prices so high, some would argue, well, there's no way we can stop oil exploration at this particular time. But you're also running into these issues of consulta previa. I don't even know how to say it in English. Questions that you cannot ignore as you're actually looking to take these sorts of decisions. At the same time, there are political elements inside of Ecuador. They're trying to take advantage of legitimate and valid, I think, concerns by the indigenous population, but are trying to use it for political gains. And there's an effort now to try to find a way to impeach Lasso by some members in a way that, for those of us who have followed Ecuador, in the past has had a tendency of removing leaders. Where the United States, I think, has a role to play here is the question of, okay, well, we're not going to just side with a government against protesters. That's just not something we're going to do. We didn't do that under when people were protesting during the Duque administration. Our approach to protests in the region are as follows. Number one is that security forces have a special responsibility and duty, and that if there are any sort of allegations of violence or overstepping by security forces, they need to be investigated and prosecuted accordingly to demonstrate that the government takes the rights and freedoms of people into account. The other is, why are people protesting? And if they're protesting because of economic issues, can we help? And is there something where we can do, where we can be responsive, help a government be responsive to the needs? Right around the times of the protests, the IMF was meeting about future. So these are areas where the U.S. can play a constructive role, just like we did with Argentina and helping secure a renewal of the IMF's largest loan in the world, $45 billion loan for Argentina to avoid an economic kind of collapse in the country. We're talking to other countries to make sure that we use our, I think, outsized role in a lot of these institutions to help these governments respond to their populations. But then, yes, when you're starting to get into the non-democratic conversation, we will stand up and say, look, democratic leaders should be allowed to govern democratically, and they need to certainly govern democratically and respond to the populations. But it'll be, I think it's tough for us to pick sides other than the side of the people that are being impacted by, I think, the broader kind of global dislocations that are happening because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. More of this is going to happen. And as I kind of mentioned to Alejandro, the political cost of leaders who are trying to take steps that are in some way structural to address the challenges that the region is facing are becoming higher. As I think a perfect example is Duque's tax reform. It was actually something that was the right thing for him to do. You can debate how it was messaged and how it was sold to, but I think it was something that he had to retract because of protests, ultimately had to put it back on the table for the country to be able to address certain issues. We as an international community in the United States need to find ways to decrease the cost of political decisions that are in the interest of these countries, whether it's at the multilaterals with concessional or grant financing, whether we can actually modernize our assistance tools to ensure that we are helping countries do these things correctly. If a country that is traditionally dependent on commodities is trying to find a way to transition away from fossil fuels, as countries like Guyana are, as they are reaping the benefits of the LISA discovery, these are areas where the United States can play an important role, not just in terms of assistance, but technical expertise. And it is something that we're very focused on.
Great. And there's a couple questions actually in the chat. Again, sort of a domestic issue that some some in the audience would like to know what the US's view on, or again, if there be some engagement by the US in the region, it has to do with public infrastructure. There's a reference to sort of corruption in public infrastructure projects or politicization of infrastructure services in Latin America and the impacts that has on the population. So again, is that something that is on the agenda for the US to engage with regional leaders about?
So the Partnership for Global Infrastructure that was launched at the G7, it's the new name for B3, what was B3W, is an area where we are working with Congress to give the Development and Finance Corporation the authorities to be able to do more of this, particularly in countries that are middle and high income. The challenge, though, is U.S. companies, I'll tell you, at least from my experience, are less focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. Companies like Bechtel and AECOM and others that are the very large kind of infrastructure companies, they are more focused in other parts of the world, and that is for a couple of reasons. Once because I think on their own, unless you're Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, or maybe Colombia, the market is just not big enough for a lot of these companies. The other is the business environment, where what we've seen, and the World Economic Forum has put out papers, others, that I think the biggest deterrent to foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean is governance and political risk. And so I think if we're ever going to be in the traditional infrastructure space, these are issues, not just the technical issues that will allow us to deploy capital, but also the issues of a business environment. However, I think for Latin America and the Caribbean, where we have a comparative advantage to, I would say, to countries like China that do low bid kind of infrastructure projects in Latin America and the Caribbean and win out because there's a state subsidy that is accompanied with that. Where the U.S. has a very definitive comparative advantage is next generation infrastructure. So issues of digital connectivity. We are very energized behind the deployment of open radio access networks, not to create necessarily a space for US companies, but to provide a platform for Latin America and the Caribbean to be competitive in its own right in space and to have choice. The other is health and health security, but it's also, I think, issues of human infrastructure. So promoting greater equity and inclusion are areas where, where we, I think, can bring a lot of resources to bear and respond again to some of the core issues. Climate transition and climate issues are ones where we have a comparative advantage and can really respond to some of the core challenges Latin America and the Caribbean is facing.
Yeah, and so much of this goes back to institutions and institutional infrastructure, right? One of the core challenges of attracting FDI is a weak judiciary because people think their investments won't be safe. So these, many of these issues come back together about what you raised a while ago about the strength of the state. One last question, Juan. There are a few questions in the chat that I'm just going to sort of paraphrase that have to do with how the region can work together if not all representatives from all countries of the region are sort of at the table and working together. So we talked about mechanisms, we talked about platforms and venues such as the OAS, but how does with heterogeneous leaders and ideologically and in every other way, what are some of the mechanisms to sort of make sure that all of those voices are heard and everyone is coordinated, not just a subset of the countries?
Yeah, and I'm going to steal, somebody said this to describe the outcomes of the Summit of the Americas, and I wish I'd thought of it. They said the United States took a multi-layered diplomatic approach to the summit, which I thought was kind of cool. It was that where we found we could find consensus, we try to work with everybody. So that's where those 5 political commitments came from. Where the United States could find core countries that were ready and willing to address these issues as partners with us, we approached them with a smaller group of countries. That's, for example, the issues of food security that we approached with Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago are ones where we came together to try to work on those issues together. And there are others where it'll be something where the United States has to engage with, I think, bilaterally. I think we have to be willing to have this conversation in a very open space. And I would say that, notwithstanding not inviting Cuba to the summit, we still engage with them. I think we still, we have Ambassador Story and Roger Carstens are in Caracas today. we have to be willing to engage with all governments in the Americas. I think the summit itself, though, is unique in that it is a venue for democratically elected leaders. That doesn't mean that we're going to run from having conversations with autocratic governments. And so I think some of these conversations you can approach as a whole, but Latin America and the Caribbean, as you know better than I do, is not homogeneous, and there are countries that are dealing with specific challenges and will be specifically tailored to be able to address some of these things together.
Wonderful. Well, this has been fantastic, Juan. Thank you again so much for joining us today, for your wonderful, candid answers, and for engaging on these issues that are so important to all of us. Alejandro, would you like to close?
Thanks, Diana. Again, thanks, Juan, for being as open, as candid, and as comprehensive in laying out what happened at the summit, but more than that, laying out the strategy of the Biden administration to engage with Latin America and to promote, democracy and a much more integrated hemisphere. So again, thanks for always being available to talk to the Georgetown community, and it has been an impressive discussion today. Thanks, and thanks, Diana.